For the last few days, the headlines have treated Lebanon as one more front in a much larger Middle East crisis. A ceasefire is announced, a strike follows, Hezbollah fires back, Israel responds, officials call for restraint, and the story moves on. But that may be the wrong way to look at it, because Iran may not be treating Lebanon as just another battlefield. It may be treating Lebanon as a test, not a test of Israel's military strength, not a test of whether Hezbollah can keep fighting, a test of whether the United States can actually control the consequences of its own alliances. Think about the timing. Washington and Tehran are trying to build a wider diplomatic process. The stated goal is to stop a regional conflict from becoming even more dangerous. The talks are tied to the Strait of Hormuz, Iran's nuclear program, sanctions, energy markets, and a fragile effort to halt fighting in Lebanon. And then, Lebanon becomes the pressure point. When fighting continues after a ceasefire is announced, Iran does not have to prove that it can defeat Israel. It does not even have to prove that the United States approves of every Israeli action. It only has to point at the gap between what Washington promises and what Washington can actually deliver. That gap is where leverage lives. Because in diplomacy, there is a huge difference between saying, "We will try to calm our ally down," and saying, "We can guarantee our ally will not take a step that destroys this agreement." One is influence, the other is control. And Iran's entire strategy may be built around forcing Washington to reveal which one it really has. This is what I call the alliance control test. The test is simple. If the United States is asking Iran to trust a wider deal, to accept inspections, to make economic and military concessions, and to reduce the risk of escalation, then Iran has a logical question. Who enforces the other side? Not in theory, not in a press statement, on the ground, in Lebanon. Tonight, I want to break down why this small strip of territory has become one of the most important credibility tests in the entire region. Why a ceasefire that looks local can decide whether talks between Washington and Tehran survive. And why the real issue is not whether America supports Israel. Of course it does. The issue is whether support has turned into a liability, because the stronger the alliance looks from the outside, the more damaging it becomes when America cannot prevent an ally from taking actions that derail its own diplomatic strategy. And before we go further, one point matters. This is not an argument that Iran controls Hezbollah's every move, or that Israel takes orders from Washington. Neither claim is realistic. This is about incentives. Iran does not need perfect control over every actor. It only needs Lebanon to remain unstable enough that Washington cannot offer Tehran a clean, credible guarantee. The timeline matters because this did not begin as a purely Lebanese crisis. The fighting between Israel and Hezbollah became tied to the broader war with Iran after Hezbollah opened fire in support of Tehran in early March. From that moment on, Lebanon was no longer a separate file. It became part of a regional chain reaction. Washington tried to pull that chain apart. In early June, U.S. facilitated talks between Israel and Lebanon produced a ceasefire framework. The structure was clear. Hezbollah would stop firing and pull operatives back from the South Litani area, while the Lebanese armed forces would take exclusive control in designated pilot zones. On paper, that is the kind of arrangement diplomats like. It has maps, it has conditions, it has security language, it has a sequence. But a deal is only as strong as the people who are supposed to follow it. And that is where the problem began. There were still strikes. There were still launches. There were still accusations. Israel said it was responding to threats from Hezbollah. Hezbollah said it would not allow Israel freedom of movement in Lebanon. Lebanon said civilians were still living under the risk of escalation. Then, as U.S. Iran talks moved closer, the Lebanon front became directly connected to the wider diplomacy. Iran made its position clear. A broader agreement could not be treated as credible while fighting in Lebanon continued. That is not just rhetoric. It turns Lebanon into a condition, and conditions change bargaining power. A condition means Tehran can say, "We are not refusing talks. We are asking whether the first promise on the page is being honored." That distinction is powerful, because it shifts the burden back onto Washington. If Washington says the deal requires an end to hostilities on all fronts, and one of those fronts is still producing strikes, then Tehran can claim that America has not delivered the very foundation of the process. Now, the American response has been to build mechanisms. A ceasefire was announced again. Technical discussions continued. U.S. and Iranian negotiators agreed on a roadmap. There were plans for a de-confliction cell focused on Lebanon, a channel designed to reduce the chance that one local incident would escalate into something larger. That is not meaningless. In fact, it is probably the most serious part of the diplomatic architecture so far. But it also reveals the weakness. If you need a new emergency mechanism immediately after announcing a ceasefire, you are admitting that the ceasefire is not self-enforcing. And from Iran's perspective, that is exactly the point. The issue is not whether Washington can make a phone call. Washington can make many phone calls. The issue is whether those calls produce behavior that Tehran can measure. Do Israeli strikes stop? Do Hezbollah attacks stop? Do forces pull back? Do civilian areas become safer? Do the next talks happen on time? That is the scoreboard. And the moment you understand Lebanon as a scoreboard, you understand why Iran keeps returning to it. Because the more fragile the calm becomes, the more Tehran can argue that America is asking for trust it has not earned. But this takes us to the heart of the issue. What does control actually mean when you are dealing with an ally that has its own military, its own security doctrine, and its own red lines? This is the point where the debate usually becomes too simple. People say America gives Israel military support, political support, intelligence cooperation, and diplomatic cover. So America must be able to stop Israel whenever it wants. That is not how alliances work. The United States has enormous influence over Israel, but influence is not a remote control. An ally can depend on you and still make choices you do not want. An ally can listen to your warnings and still decide that its own security threat is more urgent than your diplomatic timetable. And that is especially true in a war zone. Israel's position is built around a basic claim. Hezbollah remains a threat, Israeli forces need room to operate, and no agreement can require Israel to accept attacks or rearmament near its border. Iran's position is built around a different claim. A deal that allows Israel to keep striking inside Lebanon is not a deal at all. It is simply a pause that Israel can end whenever it wants. Both sides can make arguments that sound internally logical, and America is stuck in the middle. Washington wants a wider agreement with Iran. It wants stability in Hormuz. It wants lower energy risk. It wants to avoid another major war. It wants Israel to remain secure, and it wants Hezbollah to stop firing. But those goals do not automatically fit together. That is why the alliance control test is not really about issuing orders. It is about whether Washington can align incentives. Can it make restraint more attractive than escalation? Can it convince Israel that keeping the diplomatic process alive is more valuable than one more operation? Can it convince Hezbollah that a pause is not simply a chance for Israel to gain advantage? Can it give Lebanon enough security and political space to prevent its territory from becoming a permanent staging ground for other people's conflict? If the answer is no, then Iran gains something very valuable. It gains the ability to say that every American guarantee comes with an asterisk. Iran can say, you want us to make irreversible concessions, but you cannot even make your own side pause long enough for negotiations to begin. That message does not need to be universally accepted. It only needs to create doubt. And in negotiations, doubt is expensive, because once a party doubts the other side can deliver, it starts demanding more. More safeguards, more verification, more economic benefits up front, more time, more conditions, more leverage. That is exactly why Lebanon is such an effective testing ground. It is visible, it is emotionally charged, it is tied directly to Israel's security. It is tied directly to Iranian influence, and every incident can be read in two ways. Israel can call it self-defense, Hezbollah can call it resistance. Iran can call it proof that Washington cannot enforce a ceasefire. America can call it a fragile process under pressure. All four narratives can exist at the same time, but only one thing matters for the wider deal. Does the violence stop long enough for trust to grow? If the answer is no, then Tehran does not need to win an argument on television. It wins leverage at the negotiating table. And that brings us to the most important part of Iran's strategy. Iran may not be using Lebanon to block diplomacy. Here is the strategic logic. Iran does not need a perfect outcome in Lebanon. It does not need Israel to withdraw tomorrow. It does not need Hezbollah to declare victory. It does not need America to publicly admit weakness. It only needs to keep the credibility question alive. Every time the truce breaks down, Tehran can raise the same argument. If the United States cannot secure the first condition, why should Iran move on to the harder conditions? That is a very difficult question for Washington to answer, because the harder conditions involve nuclear inspections, sanctions relief, frozen assets, maritime security, and the wider balance of power in the Middle East. Lebanon is the smaller test, but it is also the first test. And first tests matter. They tell both sides what the rest of the process will feel like. This is why Iran can gain leverage even without walking away from talks. It can stay in the room. It can say it supports diplomacy. It can allow technical meetings to continue. And at the same time, it can insist that progress is impossible until Washington shows it can enforce calm where it has the most influence. That is not necessarily a strategy to destroy the deal. It may be a strategy to rewrite the price of the deal. Because if America wants the process to continue, it may feel pressure to offer more economic guarantees, more written commitments, more monitoring, more political pressure on Israel, more flexibility on sequencing. And the more Washington offers to keep the process alive, the more Iran can claim that time is working in its favor. Now, there is a strong counterargument. Washington can say that the very existence of a new ceasefire proves American influence is real. The United States helped bring Israel and Lebanon into a negotiation process. It helped produce a framework for pilot zones under Lebanese armed forces control. It helped create a de-confliction mechanism. And in the latest round, violence did fall sharply after Saturday evening. That is not nothing. It is evidence that diplomacy can still change behavior. But the weakness is obvious too. A ceasefire that survives only when every actor is waiting for the next strike is not yet a stable ceasefire, and Iran knows that. It does not need the whole structure to collapse. It only needs the structure to feel temporary. A temporary system gives Tehran room to delay. A fragile system gives Tehran room to demand. A divided system gives Tehran room to negotiate through intermediaries and avoid appearing to respond directly to American pressure. And that is why the real battlefield here is not just southern Lebanon. It is perception. Who looks patient? Who looks desperate? Who looks capable of delivering? Who looks trapped by events they do not fully control? In every negotiation, the side that appears to need the agreement more often pays more for it. Iran understands that. So the key question is not whether Tehran can force America to control Israel. It cannot. The question is whether Tehran can force America to prove over and over again that it cannot fully control the timing of Israeli military action. If it can, then every future negotiation begins with Iran holding one more card, and that card has consequences far beyond Lebanon. The danger is that Lebanon turns into a lever that pulls on everything else. A strike in southern Lebanon does not stay in southern Lebanon. It can affect talks in Switzerland. It can affect the Strait of Hormuz. It can affect oil markets. It can affect whether sanctions waivers are implemented. It can affect how Gulf states calculate risk. It can affect whether Iran believes a 60-day roadmap is worth taking seriously. That is how local conflicts become regional traps. The United States is trying to solve several problems at once. It wants to stop the direct conflict with Iran. It wants commercial shipping to move safely through Hormuz. It wants to prevent Hezbollah from remaining a direct threat to Israel. It wants to support Lebanon's state institutions, and it wants to avoid being dragged into an open-ended regional war. Israel's priority is narrower and more immediate. It wants to prevent Hezbollah from rebuilding military capacity near its border. It wants freedom to act against threats, and it does not want a diplomatic document to become a shield for an armed group it still sees as dangerous. Lebanon's priority is survival. The Lebanese government wants calm, displaced families want to return, and the Lebanese armed forces are being asked to take on responsibilities that are politically and militarily enormous. Iran's priority is leverage. Tehran wants economic relief, strategic breathing room, and proof that Washington cannot simply dictate regional terms while asking Iran to compromise. These priorities collide in the same space. That is what makes Lebanon so dangerous. Not because one side has a perfect plan, but because everyone has a reason to keep a little bit of pressure alive. And when every actor keeps a little bit of pressure alive, the ceasefire becomes a thin layer stretched over a much deeper conflict. This is also why Qatar and Pakistan matter. They are not simply delivering messages. They are increasingly acting as intermediaries between sides that do not trust one another enough to speak directly without conditions. That creates a strange reality. The more mediation is needed, the more it proves that direct control is weak. And the more control looks weak, the more valuable Iran's Lebanon test becomes. Now there are three paths from here. The first is managed calm. The ceasefire holds just enough. The de-confliction channel works. Israel limits operations. Hezbollah limits attacks. Technical talks continue. Nobody gets what they truly want, but nobody wants to be blamed for collapse. The second is controlled deterioration. There are small strikes, small attacks, and constant accusations. The wider deal does not collapse, but every step becomes slower and more expensive. Iran uses Lebanon to extract more guarantees. Washington uses sanctions and diplomacy to keep the process alive. Everyone calls it progress because the alternative is worse. The third is rupture. A major strike, a large casualty event, or a cross-border escalation destroys the political space for restraint. Iran says the first commitment was broken. Israel says it acted against a threat. So what should you watch now? Not the loudest speech, not the most dramatic headline. Watch the mechanisms. First, watch Israel's military posture inside southern Lebanon. If Israel keeps forces in the security zone while saying it is operating defensively, that tells you Israel is trying to preserve freedom of action without openly breaking the ceasefire. But if new airstrikes begin again at scale, Iran will have immediate evidence for its argument that Washington cannot turn commitments into restraint. Second, watch Hezbollah's behavior. If Hezbollah limits launches and avoids testing the border, that gives the ceasefire breathing room. If it resumes fire, Israel will say it has no choice but to respond. And once that cycle starts, Washington's ability to frame the issue as a diplomatic technicality disappears. Third, watch the de-confliction cell. This may sound boring, but it is actually the most important new piece of the architecture. A direct crisis management channel is what prevents one rocket, one drone, one raid, or one misunderstanding from becoming the excuse for a much larger war. If that mechanism produces quiet results, the wider talks get stronger. If it becomes another room where people trade accusations, the wider talks become more fragile. Fourth, watch how Iran describes Lebanon. If Tehran begins to speak less about immediate retaliation and more about verification, guarantees, and implementation, that suggests it wants to use Lebanon as bargaining leverage inside the process. If it speaks instead about betrayal, collapse, and irreversible failure, that suggests it is preparing the political ground for a harder confrontation. And finally, watch Washington's language. The real test is not whether the United States says it supports Israel. That has never been in doubt. The test is whether Washington starts defining what successful restraint actually looks like. Can it say what actions would violate the understanding? Can it say what happens when they occur? Can it say who is responsible for keeping the calm? Can it show that the agreement has consequences for every side, not only Iran? Because credibility is not created by saying, "Trust us." Credibility is created when all sides see that breaking the rules has a cost. And that is the problem at the heart of Lebanon. Iran is asking whether America can control Israel. But the deeper question is more difficult. Can America build an arrangement where Israel does not need to be controlled because restraint is more useful than escalation? That is a much harder task. And it is the task that will decide whether Lebanon becomes the first building block of a wider peace or the fault line that breaks the entire process apart. This is Daniel Breaks It Down. And in this story, the most important thing to watch is not who claims victory. It is who can keep a ceasefire alive when no one trusts anyone else to do it.